So this afternoon, I'm going to start off by telling you some history of our White Mountains. If we go back well over 1,000 or more years ago, the original inhabitants up here were the Abenaki Indians. They were here for centuries before anybody else. And by the late 1700s, a family named the Crawford showed up in the sheer wilderness, and they're kind of the pioneers of North Country and modern-day civilization. In fact, they did a lot to open up North Country, including building the first road to connect Vermont and Maine, and that opened up trade and commerce and tourism slowly but surely over the next 50 years. Now, our big bang came with the arrival of the railroads in the 1840s, and they were coming north, cutting their way toward Canada, to connect Canada to many of our major cities in the Northeast. So that's when we got our big boom in trade and commerce and population growth. A lot of cities and towns sprang up here. A lot of industry moved up here. And that was the discovery of tourism. Now back then, the only people who could afford to come up here as tourists were the wealthiest people in our country, families of the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, many of their wealthy friends. And they would come up by rail and ask to be let off the train and wander off in our woods to go hiking. And while they were at it, they went hunting and fishing for food. And at the end of the day, wherever they ended up, they pitched their tents and they went camping. Now that worked out pretty well, maybe the first, second, third time, but after that, all these wealthy wives hated it. And for good reason. Can you imagine Mrs. Carnegie, Mrs. Vanderbilt, Mrs. Rockefeller laying out in our woods in a tent in the pouring rain? That's not how they rolled. So over the next 20 years, they built 33 grand hotels, including the Mount Washington Hotel. And now people were arriving by rail and checking in for the whole summer. And once they got settled, they pulled out their money and tried to outspend each other. And it was nicknamed the Gilded Age of the White Mountains because in the very beginning, this was exclusively a playground for the rich and famous. Regular people couldn't afford to come up here. Now that went on for 50 years. Until after the Great Depression, and with the automobile becoming more popularized. For the first time in the 1930s, a lot of regular people were driving their Model Ts up here. Now they couldn't afford the exorbitant rates of the Grand Hotels, so it was their turn to go camping or sleeping in their cars. That market was growing so fast, they built hundreds of low-cost hotels and inns and bed and breakfasts for that regular person's market. And at the same time, wealthy people were still coming up here, but they were driving instead of taking a train. They also had that adaptability of their automobiles. Rather than staying the whole summer, they were just checking in for a couple of nights because now they could drive to Montreal, drive down to Boston, drive over to Bar Harbor, Maine. And almost overnight, all of our grand hotels were 50 to 75% empty, and they couldn't cover their costs. And over the next couple of decades, all but a few of our grand hotels ended up going out of business. Now, despite that little setback in our economy, which really wasn't a setback at all, one offset the other, tourism has continued to grow into what it is today, which is New Hampshire's #1 industry, and it's also the state's largest revenue producer. So tourism is a real big deal up here in New Hampshire and the White Mountains. Well, the next thing I want to talk about with you is the history of our railway. This all began with the birth of Sylvester Marsh, 1803. Born on a farm about 40 miles south of here. From the day Sylvester was born, he was an entrepreneur. As a toddler, he was always taking things apart, putting them back together again. By the time he got into his early teens, He was a whiz kid at fixing all the farm equipment, and by the time he got into his late teens, his parents knew he had a lot of promise. So they sent him down to Boston, to the university, to pursue an engineering degree. And after he completed that degree, it was the gold rush in America. So rather than come back to agriculture in New Hampshire, instead, Sylvester hops on a train, off he goes to California to seek a much larger fortune. Now, he never made it to California. He made it only as far as Chicago. And this guy was an entrepreneur, right? An out-of-the-box thinker, a dreamer. And he's out in Chicago one morning, looking at the plains and all the wild livestock running around, and how the transcontinental railway is quickly connecting our country. And he has kind of a eureka moment. He decides right on the spot, forget about California. There's plenty of opportunity right there in Chicago. So he settled in Chicago, where the population was just 300 people at the time. And the idea that he dreamed up was to partner up with the railroads and create America's first and largest national meat packing operation, having the railroads distribute his meat products all across the country. All the local butchers obviously laughed at him. Who's this crazy young Easterner coming out here and telling us how to run our business, disrupting everything? But Sylvester stayed the course, followed his vision, and within 10 years, Sylvester was the founder of the modern-day meat packing operation for the industry in Chicago. Stockyards, the whole modern-day infrastructure. Founder of the meat packing industry. And we stayed on a few more decades, and he grew that original company into the largest meat packing and processing operation in North America, with multiple manufacturing and distribution facilities. And in the process, he became a billionaire. Now, after all of that success, by the mid-1800s, Sylvester retired. So he makes a big decision to sell his company and come back east to retire. Now again, Sylvester was a crazy entrepreneur, couldn't sit still, always looking for what he could get into next. What's the next sport here? So when he got back here, retirement was totally out of the question. He immediately started looking for a new career. And while he was doing that, he hiked to the summit of Mount Washington. When he got up there, he could see over 130 miles in every direction. And he has another one of these epiphany moments. He's thinking everybody should have the opportunity to enjoy the views he was looking at. So he hiked down, didn't say anything, but about a month later, the billionaire buys up all this land, and he announced publicly that he's going to invent the world's first mountain climbing railway to the summit of Mount Washington for tourism. Now when he announced that, everybody laughed at him, especially the railroad industry, who tried this and failed. They called him a lunatic. They called him Crazy Sylvester. They asked him, why would you want to throw your fortune away on a project that we've already tried and know is impossible? It can't be done. And we're the railroad experts. What do you know about railroads? Nothing. But again, Sylvester stayed the course, followed his new vision, and took him about 10 years. He experimented with multiple different technologies, trying to figure out how to get up the steep grades of these mountains. And he failed over and over again. But one day, his breakthrough came when he borrowed an idea from a bicycle, sprocket and a chain. And I told you how this works. Now back then he made a tabletop model, and kind of decided that this is the technology that's going to make all of this happen. So the next thing he did was build a prototype steam engine, integrating the cogs, and a set of tracks integrating the rack up to this water tank behind me, in front of me, excuse me. And a few months later, he made it up to the water tank with power to spare, and convinced himself that he was now ready to tackle a summit. Now the next thing he did amazed everybody. He publicly announced that he was hiring 257 access to power equipment, excavators, bulldozers, nothing. This whole railway was built on sheer muscle and manpower. And it took them less than 2 years to complete our entire railway. On July 3rd, that's the day in our history. Sylvester Marsh, his first train of 8 passengers up to the southern Washington and back. That was 1869, 155 years ago. That's why you're on the history. Now, prior to that, summit, since our founding, over the years, millions and millions of people have been able to enjoy our summit experience. Today, the Cloud Railway has been built to become states and regions' largest and most popular tourist attraction. Well over 130,000 passengers every year to our summit. So that's a little bit of history about our railway. I'm going to get a little break now, and once we get up to our switches, we'll talk about something else. And also making sure when we get up to these switches, they're set on properly so that we don't derail. So when you get on my coach today, I bet you didn't realize that your life is in my hands, did you? It's not that complicated. Now the reason we're not going to the summit today, I'll mention that to you. All day long, the winds have been in the 80s and 90s, gusting every 10 minutes, 120, 130 miles an hour. That's why we're not going to the summit. And the wind chill with all of those winds is like 8 to 11 degrees. So it's pretty cold up there. Almost like behind a big rock, out of the worst weather, which is where we're going to stop up there. The rate of our tracks is 25%. For every 100 feet we go forward, we're rising 25 feet. That's a very steep grade. Some of you might have seen a grade on a highway. Caution, 5.5%. Now that's kind of laughable, guys. That's nothing. Our average is 25%. And I'm going to be taking you over a trestle up above where the grade is almost 40%. We're going to go semi-vertical. Now these grades can sometimes create illusions. I bet you didn't think that you might have an illusion on the Cloud Railway today, did you? Maybe you will, maybe you won't. Let's see what happens. Thought the building was crooked. The building back there is perfectly level and achieved by our track. Now that you know the building is perfectly level, and you look in the picture window, guess who is different? We are. What happens on these steep grades is that your brain can interpret the information the exact opposite of reality, making you think something out there is instead of 14 feet lower than. Anybody figure out why? Well, I'll tell you what, look at the tracks. We're climbing the mountain like this right now. 37% grade. Again, that's because you're at the home of the world's worst weather.